Good afternoon and welcome to Hopkins at Home. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Patterson. I'm a clinical genetic counselor in the Department of Genetic Medicine at Johns Hopkins. And we are so excited to have you with us today for this conversation on Science Explained, the power, promise, and pitfalls of DNA test kits. I am pleased to be joined by my colleague Kelsey Guthrie, also a clinical genetic counselor in the Department of Genetic Medicine at Johns Hopkins. Kelsey provides genetic counseling to pediatric and adult patients in the metabolic genetics and general genetics clinic at Hopkins. She brings particular expertise in metabolic disorders and hereditary conditions and is deeply committed to education and community outreach, helping individuals and families better understand complex genetic information and use it to make informed decisions. Now, as consumer DNA test kits grow in popularity, many people are curious about what these tests can and, importantly, what they cannot tell them. From ancestry insights to health-related findings, genetic testing can feel overwhelming, confusing, exciting. Our goal today is to help clarify how these tests work and what limitations they have, what ethical considerations you may have, and how to think critically and responsibly about genetic information. Today's program will feature a moderated discussion followed by time for audience questions. And we encourage those watching live to submit questions using the chat feature throughout the program. We'll address as many as we can in the Q&A portion. So with that, let's get started. Throughout this session, we'll review background on genetics and genetic counseling, then discuss examples of direct-to-consumer testing, as well as comparisons with clinical diagnostic genetic testing. And then we'll finish up with some special considerations of genetic testing at large, and then open it up for Q&A. So, to set the stage for the rest of our talk, when we say genetics, we're talking about our DNA, the instruction manual for our body, written out in a long string of letters. DNA is wrapped up in structures called chromosomes and further broken up into segments called genes, all of which code for different proteins in our body. Variation in the spelling of our DNA is what makes us all unique. And some variants in genes that disrupt protein development or disrupt protein function can ultimately cause a genetic condition or symptoms of a disease. And that brings us to genetic counseling, what Kelsey and I do. The term first coined in 1947. Genetic counseling is the process by which a professional helps a person or family understand the medical, ethical, psychosocial, reproductive, familial implications of genetics and genetic conditions. Now, genetic counselors typically have master's level clinical and research training, and we work in a variety of different settings. Someone may traditionally seek out or be referred to genetic counseling due to a family history of disease, suspicious symptoms in the person, preconception or prenatal genetic risk assessment, while in recent years, genetic counseling and testing has been increasingly utilized for precision medicine and decisions about treatment, proactive health screening, pharmacogenetics, and more. We, as genetic counselors, use a bunch of different tools when working with a patient or family, which can include genetic testing, but is not necessarily a requirement. Now, some listening may have had genetic testing through pregnancy, maybe something called carrier screening, or maybe a child had a genetic test for a birth anomaly or following newborn screening. We are here to reinforce that genetic testing and counseling is available throughout the lifespan, as genetic conditions do not only appear in childhood, a common misconception, and may instead become apparent over time. Additionally, genetic testing may include looking at a single genetic variant, maybe something known in the family, or one single gene, or it can span much wider and broader into sequencing all the known genes, like whole exome sequencing, or all the known DNA in the body, such as whole genome sequencing. And to clarify, the genetic testing that I'm referring to is considered clinical diagnostic testing, what us genetic counselors and geneticists may be ordering and working with it in our clinics. The labs that offer this testing go through rigorous testing, regulatory processes and approvals, continuing reviews of quality and protocols. And as genetic counselors, we are trained to help make appropriate recommendations for specific tests or labs based on the health indication at hand, the cost, insurance, technology, customer service, sample type, and availability, timing, and so much more. These companies and institutions on screen are just a few examples that offer clinical diagnostic genetic testing, and you may come across if you have genetic testing through a genetic counselor, geneticist, or another specialty provider. Now, as mentioned, genetic testing typically reads through a DNA sequence to look for variants that do not match the reference sequence. Once clinical testing is sent, results are typically returned to the provider first and may, let's say, be positive, which means it detected a clear variant. And it's classified as either pathogenic or likely pathogenic, meaning known to be associated with a genetic condition. Now, on the contrary, a negative result means that no clinically relevant variant was detected through the testing. And then in the middle here, a VUS, a variant of unknown or uncertain significance, means kind of what it sounds like. A variant was detected, but there's not enough evidence to classify it as associated with a genetic disease, symptom, or risk. Or is it benign and not harmful and just part of human variation? There are multiple criteria that need to be hit for a variant to be classified into one of these buckets. And a genetic counselor is trained to sift through and interpret variants to help educate the patient and family on the implications. Now, all of this background just helps us illustrate the complexity of genetics, genetic results, and implications for a patient and family. Additionally, a negative result does not 100% negate the possibility of a genetic condition. We often talk about things like multifactorial inheritance, which indicates that many different factors, genetic and environmental, must come together to produce a trait or symptom. Our testing technology is not currently sophisticated enough to be able to identify all genetic factors in multifactorial conditions and traits. And all in all, genetic information is complex and can impact many different aspects of life, not only for the patient, but the broader family structure as well. So with that, we're going to move on to our next session, and I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey.
Thanks, Amy. So a large majority of the time, like Amy discussed in the background section, genetic testing is done through healthcare providers like physicians or us, genetic counselors. And in this case, a health insurance company is usually covering part or all of the costs of the testing. And this is called clinical genetic testing, as we just discussed. However, now we want to turn our attention to direct-to-consumer genetic testing, which has become increasingly available and utilized over recent years. Direct-to-consumer, or DTC testing, are marketed directly to customers via mostly the internet or TV or some other advertising mechanism. After purchasing a test kit, a customer sends a sample and receives results directly from a website or app usually. DTC genetic testing does not involve a healthcare provider or a health insurance company in the process. This is a slide showing some of the first direct-to-consumer companies that existed. Many people have heard of 23andMe, which was founded in 2006 and has gone through a myriad of changes over the years. Another popular one is Ancestry.com. Many of the companies pictured here offer DTC tests to look for a limited set of genetic variations to make predictions about certain aspects of health, provide information about common traits, and offer clues about a person's ancestry. These DTC test companies are not analyzing the entire gene or providing a complete set of information, but are looking for a select number of variations that could be contributing to a described condition or trait. So as time has gone on with DTC testing, we have seen a shift from the types of DTC test I just mentioned, the ancestry, health risks, and traits, to what is now being advertised as broader genetic testing like exome, genome, or functional health testing. So we're going to take a look at some of those newer companies now. These pictures are from a company called sequencing.com, which advertises a complete genome for lifelong health intelligence. From my experience browsing the website, the price of this seems to fall between $399 to $799. And everyone gets the main report, which is shown here on the left with an example variant. There are additional reports you can order in your bundle initially, or you can add on after. So I have a screenshot of some of those reports on the right. All of these reports, the main and the additional reports, are AI generated. There is a long list of conditions that they say were tested for at the end of the main report. But of note, this test does not consider your medical or family history at all and does not involve any human or doctor reviewing the report, which clinical genetic testing would. So that means that it may be hard to answer what was tested for or how thoroughly something was tested for if a specific question comes up after doing something like this. The company does offer genetic counseling through a third-party source for an additional cost, but there seems to be no help with interpretation of the results included in your bundle at the initial purchase. Another newer company that's offering DTC testing is Genova Diagnostics. This company does not have prices listed unless you make an account, which I did not do. But they state they offer functional health testing. They have many tests on their menu, but the one that's highlighted here is called the metabolomics test. The website states this test is a non-invasive, personalized nutritional assessment that analyzes key biomarkers, allowing clinicians to target nutritional therapies to address insufficiency, promote health, and longevity. They state that common clinical indications for this type of testing would include mood disorders, fatigue, chronic stress, and inflammation. So I can see how this DTC test can sound helpful to many people. From my experience reviewing some of these reports, the reports are complex, lengthy, and hard to clinically interpret at this time. These markers are vastly different than the markers that biochemical geneticists that Amy and I work with, than the markers that they're looking at when they diagnose genetic inborn errors of metabolism. And I can't speak for everyone, but I know at least at Johns Hopkins, our biochemical geneticists are not able to interpret or see people solely for abnormalities on this type of testing at this time based on limited data. Another type of DTC testing being offered lately is wellness and methylation testing through companies such as Life DNA. Methylation in genetics is when a methyl group is added to a molecule such as DNA, which can then turn a gene on or off. These genetic modifications are also known as epigenetics. While errors in methylation can cause some known genetic disorders, the methylation testing offered by these companies cannot detect those known genetic disorders. Instead, these companies are looking for abnormalities in genes they claim would affect the body's ability to do methylation, which could in turn affect wellness. We have very little and limited evidence surrounding the changes these companies are looking for at this time. In addition, it has been difficult for myself and others in the field to gather information from these companies on the science behind what they're doing. Pharmacogenetic testing is something that can be direct to consumer or clinical genetic testing. This is the study of how multiple genes affect an individual's response to medication related specifically to concentration or dose. Approximately 15 to 30% of variability in drug response is due to genetic variations. Other things do play a role in medication response, including diet, lifestyle, age, overall health, and environment. However, there are some medications that have known pharmacogenetic implications and prescribing guidelines. So knowing about these associations may allow people who are experiencing side effects to be able to avoid those. The goal of pharmacogenetic testing is to be able to choose the right dose and drug that is best for that individual to avoid adverse drug reactions. And these are some sample pharmacogenomic test reports from a company I order from clinically called OneOme. And I put these up here to share how complex the reports can be, just to help set some expectations if you do decide to get this testing. The right picture here is showing a comprehensive report, which is organized by medication affected with kind of like a red, yellow, and green schematic. And this organization, I think, makes it easier to find answers to targeted questions about certain medications. The picture on the left is their gene report, which is a little bit more difficult to decode without the help of a physician or a genetic counselor. So I would say if you're interested in this type of testing, it can be really useful, but it's helpful to have a physician on board if you're thinking about going to the direct-to-consumer route because it can be hard to interpret and figure out what's clinically actionable on the back end. And even if nothing is clinically actionable now, it may be in the future. So it's helpful to have somebody on board who's either prescribing the medications or your primary care physician to help you make sense of these results a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to pass it back to Amy now that I've gone through the main types of direct-to-consumer testing. I'll pass it back to Amy to compare DTC to clinical genetic testing.
Okay, thanks, Kelsey. So, just like Kelsey mentioned, now that we've gone through some examples and looked at some of the possible reports, we're going to do some comparison and discuss some broader implications and considerations for someone who is thinking about going through some kind of genetic testing, whether that's direct consumer or through clinical diagnostic testing. So, when ordering genetic testing, genetic counselors and providers are trained to help assess the most useful testing technology and methods to help identify the root cause of a symptom or disease. One method commonly used by direct consumer companies is actually called genotyping, which means they're scanning the DNA for one common variant and making a conclusion based on the presence or absence of that variant. In the picture at the bottom of the screen for genotyping, you can see that in the book, it skips over a bunch of letters to see if there is the A nucleotide in the expected spot. This is most often how ancestry testing is conducted. They look for a few specific common markers in DNA that, let's use me for an example. For me, they were looking to see if common markers in my DNA match the same pattern as the Swedish population. I am Swedish, and that confirmed, yes, I am this percentage Swedish. Okay. This is also used for genetic conditions with a few common variants, such as hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, cystic fibrosis, and more. This tech is faster and cheaper compared to kind of full sequencing methods that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But remember, only looks at hotspots in the DNA and therefore misses potentially rare or useful or clinically relevant variants. Sequencing, you may hear the terms next-gen sequencing or high-throughput sequencing, for example. It's done by many clinical diagnostic test companies that look for rare genetic variants, especially in the wake of a symptom or if a suspected condition is present, and for research such as gene disease discovery. This is high-resolution testing, which increases the cost and does take longer time. So, as a word of caution, many direct-to-consumer tests that advertise full sequencing, like Kelsey had shown with sequencing.com, they still actually use classical genotyping approaches to pull out the most common variants in hotspots. So, just a word of caution. Now, another consideration for genetic testing is the quality of data. Clinical genetic testing companies must be FDA approved and CLIA and CAP certified. CLIA and CAP are regulatory bodies that ensure labs are offering reliable and accurate technology and data. Notably, some direct-to-consumer test companies are FDA approved, but are then not CLIA and CAP certified, which means they can't be used for diagnostic testing or to make medical decisions. On lab websites that do offer sequencing, you also may see a note about something called sequencing depth and sequencing coverage, which tells you how many times a region of DNA was read through. Now, this is necessary because sequencing mistakes do happen constantly. It's looking through billions of base pairs, billions of letters, and in a relatively rapid amount of time. And so you will have more accurate, more reliable results if you sequence or read through the same region multiple times. The number of times one region is looked at is considered the depth or read depth. For example, the read depth in this graphic for one region is 4 times because you can see that there is overlap of those gray bars in that navy blue arrow 4 times, 4 bars. Now, many direct consumer companies offer maybe 1 to 30 times read depth, many just offering 10 times read depth, while quality standards for clinical diagnostic testing typically requires them to hit 30 to 40 or greater read depth. Meanwhile, the coverage is in reference to the test's ability to look over the whole genome or all the DNA. And on average, how much of the whole genome is covered. One direct-to-consumer testing company only reports 0.4x, zero point 0.4 times coverage on their sequencing, which actually means it's not even looking at all of the DNA. So it's looking at the DNA on average less than one time, meaning that it will not only report false positives, but also miss many variants. So additionally, the types of results that are being reported out can differ in DTC companies versus clinical testing. While DTC offers results like eye color, ancestry, risk variance for wellness, some health conditions, clinical diagnostic testing often and typically only covers real genetic conditions that can have management and clinical implications. Um, DTC companies often will only report out clearly pathogenic variants, meaning known to be disease causing, while clinical testing may report clinically relevant uncertain variants as well, so that a person's clinical team can help consider the variant in the context of the person's symptoms, let's say, what we would call clinical correlation. In direct consumer testing companies, some have a review team or a medical director look over results and final reports, but this is not required. While it is required for clinical testing, and this especially helps control for things like false positives or misclassified results. Additionally, clinical teams occasionally will request the raw data for further analysis by a genetic counselor, geneticist, or research team. And the raw data does need to be processed and cleaned into a readable format, and can include actually all variant types, including benign or not disease causing, as well as uncertain and pathogenic variants. Some DTC companies do offer to release the raw data to the patient or client, but then the patient is actually stuck with their own data in an unreadable format with thousands and thousands of potentially benign variants to sift through and no option for secure storage of data. In thinking about everything I've mentioned, especially quality and results, a paper published in 2018 showed that actually about 40% of variants on direct-to-consumer testing results were false positives. They made the point that many variants reported as a risk variant as well are actually classified as likely benign or not disease causing when looked at under standard clinical variant classification guidelines. So, clinical correlation, meaning looking at the symptoms, confirmation of results using a secondary testing method, and expert review is necessary for accurate and reliable and useful results. So again, this should serve as a reminder that DTC results can be interesting and fun. Like I know I have photic sneeze response, meaning I have a marker where I sneeze in the sun, but take everything with a grain of salt. So here we present a summary slide of some of the points that I made before, but with a couple extra considerations for access and support. Now, we understand many of the factors as to why direct consumer testing has become very popular. Kelsey mentioned some of these. For one, it is accessible. An individual can order it for themselves in their home from their couch without waiting for a genetics evaluation or having to travel. They also offer out of pocket costs, so people don't have to deal with insurance. And the marketing is quite flashy and fun and bright, and the results look fun and proactive. I get ads for this all the time on Instagram, Facebook, every possible social media site. As a useful anecdote, one of my patients actually assumed that the cost of clinical diagnostic testing, even with insurance, would be thousands of dollars. So she paid $600 for sequencing through a DTC lab. She then received an overwhelming and confusing report that did not even detect actually the reason for her clear clinical symptoms that have been present from birth. And there was no support offered, no genetic counselor or customer service provider with that company who could help her make sense of the report or her complex feelings about not having a diagnosis, even though there was something clearly going on. Now, once she did finally actually get connected with our clinical genetics team, insurance covered her testing entirely because we could prove medical necessity due to her symptoms. And we were able to reach a diagnosis for her through sequencing, which included a rare variant, which was ultimately missed by the direct consumer testing lab. So, with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Kelsey for some special considerations and closing us out.
Yes, thank you, Amy. So Just thinking about special considerations when it comes to direct to consumer and also clinical genetic testing. So this slide is showing some ethical topics to consider when we're thinking about genetic testing in general. We're going to look a bit more at a few of these, including informed consent and privacy and ownership now. So, informed consent is the process by which the treating healthcare provider discloses appropriate information to a competent patient so that the patient may make a voluntary choice to accept or refuse treatment. Usually, there's no formal informed consent as part of the direct to consumer testing process. You can see on this slide some of the key pieces that are part of a genetic counselor's informed consent when we're speaking with someone about doing broad genetic testing. Of note, not all of these may apply to direct to consumer testing, depending on the type of testing that's being ordered. But it's important to highlight that not having informed consent may make it more likely there will be confusion or misunderstanding about results on the back end. Regarding privacy and ownership, something to be aware of or maybe look into before doing direct to consumer testing is that HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which protects sensitive health information in many settings, does not protect data held by most DTC companies. So that means that often third parties like pharmaceutical companies, marketing groups, research groups, or even law enforcement may be able to access DTC data, regardless of whether the person chose to upload it to a third party interpretation service or not. And another food for thought question is what happens when a company disbands or is sold? This recently happened with 23andMe and was in the news, which I'm sure caused many people additional stress. And while we are on this topic, it's important to know when you're making a decision about undergoing genetic testing that there is a law called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA for short, which is a U.S. federal law that protects against genetic discrimination in the workplace and through one's health insurance. It does not apply to some things such as private life insurance, disability, or long-term care insurance, but there can be state laws that may or may not cover these things as well. So make sure to look into that, whatever applies to your state. And then for testing in children, there are also some special considerations to be aware of. The situations can vary, but in general, we in genetics are guided by this paper from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which states that the autonomy of the child should be protected, and therefore non-urgent genetic testing decisions should be deferred until the child is older, except in situations where their medical care would be impacted before age 18 if we knew they had a specific risk or condition. So, this would mean in general, we would not recommend DTC testing for a child at this time. A clinical team would be best to help talk through the situation and what type of genetic testing, if any, is appropriate for a child. So to wrap up here are some takeaway points from our slides today. So first, consider the risks and limitations before doing direct-to-consumer testing. It may be appropriate for proactive information, getting information of interest, or ancestry testing. If you have a health problem you're searching for answers for, though, clinical genetic testing may be better. No test, even clinical genetic testing, can detect everything. There's a lot we don't know, and without symptom-driven clinical genetic testing, it's really hard to make a clinical correlation, especially with direct-to-consumer testing. And thirdly, take DTC results with a grain of salt. Sometimes they are correct and sometimes not, but most of the time they are only a small, limited piece of the puzzle. And before we close, I wanted to make note that we have seen an increase in referrals recently for people who want to review direct-to-consumer results in our clinical genetics clinic. And for all the reasons we outlined today, our genetics practice is not able to review full direct-to-consumer data or results at this time. Very rarely, we may see someone for a targeted question or variant of concern that has come up on a DTC test. But in general, when we get these referrals, we're acknowledging that this can be overwhelming, but we're encouraging people to schedule an appointment with us to discuss clinical genetic testing, their medical history, their family history, and just kind of start from there. And I think that will wrap it up. The next slide should be some of our references. And then Thank you guys for listening. We are going to move on to the Q&A now, and I'm going to pass it back to Amy to get us started with that.
Okay, thank you guys so much for listening. We do have a couple questions here, and I think one that actually directly relates, Kelsey, to what you were just talking about with Gina. Can you, or I can also jump in and talk again to Calvin's question, is DNA testing covered by privacy rules like HIPAA? And is there concern about data being used by like insurance companies to flag people for things or sold to advertisers? And how we usually talk about that in clinic.
Yeah, so let me start with the insurance part of the question since we were just kind of talking about Gina, and then I'll pass back to you, Amy. You can fill in
Mm-hmm.
any gaps. So, Um, with the insurance company, so Gina does cover any genetic testing that you order if it explains a health problem that you currently have, or if it's pre-symptomatic, meaning you don't have any health problems now, but a genetic test shows you're at an increased risk of something in the future, such as cancer. The law that we were talking about, that's a US federal law, Gina, that does protect your employer and your health insurance from being able to use that against you. So to charge you a higher premium, to deny you employment. There are some exceptions to Gina. So like if you're in the military, Gina does not apply. And if you're at a company that has less than 15 people, Gina may not apply. But in general, it protects you from discrimination in the workplace and through health insurance. Those other types of insurances that I mentioned, long-term care, disability, life insurance, the policy will really vary by state at this point. So that's something to just look into based on the state that you live. Um, and then I think the second half, do you want to, Amy,
Sure,
can I
I can
pass it
I
to you
can
for
touch
the
on the second half. So um, I think aside from Gina, yes, a lot of clinical diagnostic or all clinical diagnostic genetic testing labs that are FDA approved and CLIA and CAP certified do have to follow HIPAA privacy laws, meaning they can't disclose results to other people, they can't share or sell data. Um, and in their internal systems, data is actually like identifying information is actually recoded, especially if there is any kind of like quality control research going on in the background. So, importantly, though, direct consumer labs do not fall under HIPAA and do not have to abide by HIPAA patient privacy laws because technically, clients or people who are buying direct consumer testing are not patients of that company and are not falling under a clinical realm. Now, a lot of DTC companies have language on their websites about the fact that they don't sell data or share data. Um, but we have also found that language kind of vague and can be confusing, and some labs don't have that language. So, again, direct consumer testing kind of can run on their own volition in some capacity. Um, so I think grand scheme, it is okay to be paranoid about your genetic data. Like, and paranoid maybe not the right word. It is okay to be nervous about your genetic data getting out. That is you, right? Um, but again, when it's done under clinical diagnostic testing guidelines or with through like a hospital or healthcare system, it does fall under HIPAA. And another important point here is that when we order genetic testing, we do submit like a medical, something that shows medical necessity to the lab and the insurance company to help have testing covered. So that is how the insurance company might know that testing is potentially going on. But notably, we're not, the lab or your healthcare team is not giving results or disclosing results directly to insurance companies. So that would always then come back from you if you were to disclose that or ask a question to your insurance about that. We can definitely answer more questions about that.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
Yeah, you want to add?
I was gonna actually, well, we had another question that's related, and I think from prior discussion with you, you might know the answer to this. So not to put you on the spot, but someone is asking, do we know like what happened with
Yeah.
23andMe? And I know from what I know, Amy's a little bit more knowledgeable maybe, but it seems like they were sold to someone else. They're still running, and they've said that data was transferred securely.
I think that's pretty
Okay.
much it. And
That's
so I did try to stay abreast of this because full disclosure, I did 23andMe and it came my whole family did it as like a hobby Christmas present, a number of years ago. And I made sure everyone took everything with a grain of salt, right? And if there was something concerning, we would go to a clinical side of things to get worked up. So exactly like Kelsey said, it got sold. The new owners have said they are abiding by everything that 23andMe had previously said, meaning that they are not selling data, sharing data. It's still following the same regulatory processes that 23andMe did. But again, language is a little bit vague, and it we don't exactly know what the next potential priorities of this company are. Is there going to be more research? Are they going to be continuing to reanalyze things? I think it is a moving target. They say they're not sharing or selling data, though. Grand scheme.
all right. So I
Okay,
see two that I'm happy to comment on, give
go
Amy
for it.
a chance to kind of look at the questions coming in.
Hmm.
She's been talking. So I see, sorry, I lost the question now. Give me one second. So if I had genetic testing a long time ago in the past, is it still relevant? And that's a great question. So it's hard to give an answer to that without knowing like what the genetic test was for. But in general, we've learned a lot in the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And so it might be that you need updated genetic testing. So it could still be relevant, but there could be like even more genetic testing that's available to you right now. That's maybe as much as I can say without knowing you or your history. But good question. I would ask your doctor or put in a referral to a genetics clinic if you have any, questions and see what they say.
Yeah, totally agree.
And then I do see a question about CRISPR, and I wanted to just talk about CRISPR more in the context of maybe treatments that have been developed and gene therapies for a minute. So the question is, how can CRISPR be used for healthcare? And do you think genetic testing is going to be even more important if and when this gets more widely used? So CRISPR is predominantly being used in the research side of things right now, not clinically, with a few exceptions. But I did kind of want to use this as a jumping off point, just with talking about a couple conditions that have FDA approved gene therapies, which are treatments for a specific genetic condition. For those people to receive these treatments, which so far are working very well for the few conditions that they're available for, they do need genetic testing in order to qualify. And so one example that I will give is I work in inherited retinal disease. So one of my specialties is ophthalmology, and I see people with retinal dystrophies. And genetic testing is very important for those people because there's one gene called RPE65, which has a gene therapy which will stop the progression of their vision loss. And that is amazing because it's a progressive vision loss condition. So since the creation of this and FDA approval of it and implementation of it, we have seen more people get genetic testing. So I think the answer to that question is that yes, as these new technologies are used to develop more treatments or potentially cures, then genetic testing will become more and more important.
I think bouncing off that, Kelsey, another question from Calvin, anecdotally, how often do you see doctors referring or recommending genetic testing? Is this increasing compared to kind of the old school clinical diagnosing? And so I think something that I'll comment on, then turn it back over to you, is that Yes, especially in the wake of new technology and new precision medicine and treatment-based outcomes with genetic conditions. I do think this is increasing. There is more awareness. I think awareness has been a big issue for genetic conditions, especially rare diseases over the years, most of which have a genetic cause. So, awareness plays a big role there. Technology and accessibility of genetic testing plays a big role. And even like we've been seeing direct consumer testing increasing, the accessibility, cost, and timing has really improved over the years for clinical genetic testing to the point that even over the past 5 years, we've seen an uptick in whole genome sequencing from 5 years ago. We really weren't clinically doing whole genome sequencing, looking at all the DNA, because now it's accessible from a cost and technology standpoint. Now, that being said, I do think we being maybe me and Kelsey and the people who go to Johns Hopkins are a little bit biased because this is a major academic medical center with a lot of resources. And so doctors in our area and at the hospital do kind of know the referral pipeline and know like when and who to refer to for genetic counseling and genetic testing. So again, it's a little bit biased probably by geography, resources, and a number of other things. Kelsey, any further thoughts on like access or increase in testing or referrals?
I think you covered it well. I mean, I
Okay.
think the farther we get out into maybe more like rural areas, it does get more difficult because a lot of the resources tend to be around major academic institutions right now. So there's a lot more barriers as you get kind of further out of cities. So I do think that knowledge is increasing, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I believe personally that implementing genetic counselors into like primary care practices is the way to go in the future, but it's to kind of recognize some of those indications that might need further genetics evaluation or who has a higher likelihood of having a genetic condition, kind of helping out in some of those rural areas. But the implementation of that is tricky to say the least, but that's kind of like a vision of where I think we could go with this. So yeah, getting better, but still lots of room for improvement.
Yep, totally agree. And I think relatively related to this, can you touch again on a question from Susan about genetic testing versus epigenetic testing or epigenetics versus kind of clinical genetics? And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
I think that the question was, how is genetic testing different from epigenetic testing? And I don't think it's different necessarily. So there are epigenetic disorders, which is just like a subset or a category of genetic disorders. Epigenetic disorders are genetic conditions that are caused by not actual changes to the DNA, but changes to these like things like methylation that I mentioned earlier, that control the genes and turn them on or off. So sometimes they can be detected through like what you might think of as regular clinical genetic testing, but then we also have special tests we can order in clinical genetics. We're not going to get into all of those today, but that can kind of detect these abnormal methylation patterns. So there's specialized tests we can order to diagnose those conditions.
Mhm.
Hopefully that answers some of what you're asking.
And I think to add on to that, even going back into a little bit of fundamentals about like epigenetics and what I like, let's say in college or grad school, started to learn about and get interested about with epigenetics was how the environment plays on our DNA and how the environment can have long-term methylation changes on our DNA that are passed down generation to generation. And so I sometimes make the distinction between, like Kelsey said, epigenetic conditions and disorders compared to just epigenetic factors that may affect certain traits over time. And for instance, one big one is like there's a number of different studies of people who went through famine from 100 to 200 years ago, and then how those experiences of famine are passed down and actually have slightly higher rates of obesity in the children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren of individuals who went through famine because of how their DNA and their body stores energy and stores calories and fat. And so, right now, I get a lot of questions in clinic about okay, how do we test for those factors? And really, our testing is not for those epigenetic factors that are not resulting in a clear genetic disorder. And it's kind of a complex space. And I think over time, maybe we will be getting more and more into potentially genetic testing for these epigenetic factors that are playing a role, like what some of the direct to consumer tests are starting to offer and do, but we don't have the clinical data to back up the findings from these tests yet. I think it will be on the horizon though. Um,
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for making that additional
mhm.
comment there. But I think that's a great note to end on as the final answer in our Q&A. Thank you guys so much for all the questions you've put through in the chat. Amy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights today. We really appreciate your perspective on this complicated topic. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about the fundamental research that drives advances in medicine, we encourage you to check out the Johns Hopkins Institute for Basic Biomedical Sciences. You can find more information at the link below. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and encourage you to join us for more free public virtual programs throughout the year. Visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu for more information. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.